Thanks for joining this afternoon's Cuppa Club with Robert Shrimpf, CEO and founder of Solar for Schools, and Wendy Litherland, Head of Education and Director of same organisation. My name is Jerome Heusinger. I'm Senior Development Manager at Ethex, supporting Solar for Schools' latest bond offer on the platform, and I am joined by my esteemed colleague, Paul Linares, who is an investment manager at Ethex and takes an enormous amount of responsibility for all the due diligence that we do with all of our investees, including Solar for Schools. Before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. This session is recorded and made available to watch, and we also edit this to a highlighted version to emphasize that this is not a financial promotion, and if you need advice, please talk to an independent financial advisor. We hope to run for 30 to 45 minutes. It's an opportunity to meet and ask questions of Robert, of Wendy, learn about the track record, and what are the investments on the bond offer funding. What are the challenges and opportunities faced by the organisation? Feel free, please, to ask lots of questions in the chat box, and we will take those questions as we go along. So just before we hand it over to Robert and Wendy, a little bit about this bond offer and what it's supporting. It's the latest if ISA eligible bond on Ethex. In total, Ethex have hosted 12 offers over the last 7 years. They fund the installation of solar arrays on the roofs of schools in the UK, generating carbon and cost savings, but importantly, and this is where Wendy will come in, also enabling the CBS to run sustainability education programs for students. You can invest in the bond offer from just £50, and investments target return of 5.5% over the next 5 years. So over to you, Wendy and Robert. Quick introductions.
Okay. Unusually, I'll start first, but it kind of makes more sense, even though ladies should go first. So I am both the founder of Solar Options for Schools. I've got two hats on. Solar Options for Schools develops the sort of software platform that enables us to do this, to develop projects on schools, to then monitor and manage those systems, and then do a lot of the online education. But because a lot of schools don't have the money to fund them, we also created the not-for-profit Solar for Schools CBS, which I'm also still a director of, and it has a number of other voluntary directors that come from the schools themselves. And the CBS is the one that then raises the money, funds the projects, and then anything that's left over in the pot at the end of once all the investors have been repaid goes back to the schools. So those are my two hats. Over to Wendy.
Yes, and I'm a fellow CBS director. I've been a director for 4 years in a voluntary capacity, and it was only this last year which I've joined Solar for Schools in a full-time capacity, having had 25 years in science education in secondary schools, the last 3 years being in leadership. So this year I head up the education for Solar for Schools, which is nationwide, and we even have go as far as global with some parts. And that includes 2 full-time educators other than myself, and we've got 10 new educators who work alongside us as well. Thank you.
So we have a great snapshot of education on your video, which is on our website at the moment, and that we have the brilliant Danielle explaining how the education piece works. And we describe this as a sort of triple whammy of impact. We've got the savings for individual schools, and we can go into that later. We've got decarbonisation, and we'd like you to talk about that a little later. But Wendy, could you bring the education piece to life on this webinar, please?
Absolutely. And also, I need to underline the fact that this is all in person. So we've spoke in person to over 35,000 school pupils this year between the team. Of that, there's around 9,000 have been secondary, but the majority of them have actually been primary school, about 25,000 students there. And that's been through lots of different means. So we always generally start with an assembly. And then follow up with a workshop. So this workshop is always bespoke to the school. For some schools, it's a science element of renewable energy. Others, it might be an eco team or the school council who want to grow into an eco team. We arrive at different schools on different journeys. And for those people who are very aware of education, the picture at this moment, sustainability is still really very new. In the whole picture of things. The government have got objectives for every school for 2025 to have a sustainability lead. So for some schools, this is already happening. I worked as a director of sustainability for 18 years before joining here. But in most schools, there isn't anybody. So new roles, we often support teachers as well. But the most enjoyable thing is to see the children wanting to cause their own action from what we do. So when we go in, we have a solar ambassador scheme where the children will then, when we leave, go on to report how the energy is faring, how much energy generated. They will talk in assemblies to the other pupils of the year groups. And some of our secondary schools go out to primary schools to help them as well. So it's not just that one visit, it's that next step as well. Which I think is very important. And a lot of teachers do appreciate that time where they can sit back and learn a little bit more about sustainability themselves, have their own thoughts about which direction their school goes in. So there's lots of different ways we can bring it alive. We have drones that we take to inspect the panels at the same time. So can you imagine how enthusiastic some of the children are seeing the drone? Obviously we do STEM workshops. It's lots of things that instigate action. A lot of questions. We have a lot of questions from the children and the teachers. So often we go back and do some CPD sessions for teachers. You'd be surprised about how much adults have never had this because it's not been in their education. If you think about where we all, sustainability is only just mentioned in the geography and the science curriculum at this moment in time. There's a big push at the moment to improve that across schools. So it's schools who've gone above and beyond the curriculum who've done this. Although one might argue that sustainability in most forms of being frugal, reusing school uniforms, switching lights off has been a normal practice for some.
Over the next 2 to 3 years, apart from expanding your network, which currently stands at around 170, how are you hoping to add to that education piece?
Yeah, so every year we go to visit the school. So we have, like I say, we've taken on 10 new educators from across the country. So that enables people to be based in a certain area and get to know the school. Because obviously it's a 25-year commitment we have to this. And what we're finding is these schools are talking to the other schools. So one school from the mats has come on board and then the rest of the mat want to follow behind. Or even better, and I think I find this even nicer when you go into a smaller primary school and they've then been recommending us to another one and therefore it goes forward. We've attended 4 different conferences this year, hosting one of our own, the Sustainability Learning Conference in the northwest of England. And this enables us to meet lots of children, lots of teachers, and obviously dispel some of the myths about solar as well. There's still a wave of people who aren't sure about how that works, about, just is it a case of you giving your roof away? What integrity have you got on the roof, etc.? So in education, there's 2 factors to what was involved. There's the operations of the school, which involves the business manager and the site supervisors. But then there's obviously the education. And sometimes never do the 2 meet. And we encourage that. And I've had some really delightful sessions where I've spoken to the business manager, gone back later, and the business manager has actually been running the eco group alongside the teacher. They've really found a new passion to be involved with the children, found a real reason to be there. Because most people work in schools because they actually like children. So it's nice to actually have the people behind the scenes more involved as well. We have site supervisors. I went over to All Saints at Ilkley and the site supervisor helps run that. Absolutely enthusiastic is there gardening with the children, as well as showing them how the data works on our website. The children manipulate that and they put it on the newsletter every week. So for us, it's, we're like planting a seed, and those roots go deep within the school. And each year it grows a little bit more. And more importantly, we're not there just to instigate a one-off educational piece. We're in there to give something that the teachers can then embed themselves, and we can come back and do something different for them, give them ideas, and start, it's sparking that imagination, because the teachers also need a little bit a spark. If you've been teaching a long time or you've had enough of the curriculum, it's looking at the curriculum from a different angle, but looking at the building the children are in and having a newfound excitement with that. Not only that, the minute they start saving in the school, the minute they can take that home, we've got to remember that some of these schools that we're turning up to, and we're saying, oh, we need to turn the heating down. Some children don't have heating at home to turn down. Yeah, we have to be really mindful of that. So if we're giving them education, if we're talking to them about, well, actually, if you're going to have an electric heater on, you really need to be heating one space rather than several spaces with this to be more efficient, understand how power works and energy. So therefore, at home, they can hopefully take this knowledge home and save their parents some money as well. All right. So we're always looking beyond. That's why, we've got a community benefit society. And we like to think it involves not just a school community, but beyond the community as well. Within those homes, the grandparents, their aunties, the people that are going around to do, everyone's happy to switch lights off, but most people don't realise that the lights are probably one of the least power hungry.
Wendy, do you have your little cards? I love those cards.
Yeah, well, not next to it at this moment in time. But yeah.
What you're talking about, Wendy, is generating ever greater levels of awareness. And in that context, can you just mention the app that is relatively new?
Yeah.
And the significance of the event that you recently hosted at the Houses of Parliament?
Absolutely, yeah. So the app has got what we call a panelizer in there. So this allows the children, which is one of the most enjoyable things. So we've got a school who's interested in joining us, and then the children can go and literally design their own solar array on top of the school roof, and it's powerful enough that real designers use this. So we can actually then compare what the children's design was to the real designer. But with that, we can give them a lesson like, why do we prefer south? Why is east-west aspect okay? So from that, we're generating ideas which are very much the STEM careers. We're thinking about architecture. In fact, people from my own school who I tested this out on is now studying architecture at Oxford and used that in his interview about using the panelizer. We have a little competition who can match up with a designer, and then we understand why. So why not this roof? And children are literally, like, one of the lessons we do is like, just look up. What else is there? What are we missing? What are we missing in school? What are we missing with the radio, the appliances, etc. The cards that Robert was referring to is we have a little card sort with everyday appliances, and they rank order, there we go, with how much power they have. So they do a little card sort, and the adults join in too. And so we're talking about like how much, say, an electric shower uses towards an immersion heater, towards a hob, towards an oven, all those things that people we see and use all the time, but nobody has an understanding of that. And again, that helps with the bills. So we're always looking for that. So the app as well. So you've got the panelizer as one point, but the other point, there's 4 different sections: energy, electricity, efficiency, and the environment, as well as our solar section to teach them all about solar energy. But these weave into the curriculum. So Key Stage 2, which is primary school, and Key Stage 3 for secondary school, all the way up to GCSE. And this is presented in a way that's not exactly the same as in school. So children aren't going, not again. There's plenty of educational apps out there, but ours is a different thing. It's got the curriculum embedded below the surface. So children can do this as a gamified option. They can go through, watch the videos. They're literally very short 2-minute videos, short engagement, quick questions, quizzes at the end. but probably for those teachers who are listening to this, if there is any, the fact that the teachers can monitor the progress as well. So they can actually set this for homework and alleviate some class time and preparation time because it's already done. So the idea is that children can have that, secondary school children, a lot of children travel on buses to school. They can be using that on the bus, or more discrete learning. So it's quite good. It gives the teachers something to check on as well, because we've got quite a lot of information embedded within that.
Could you talk about the geographical spread of your activities, and specifically how that will change in terms of socioeconomic representation over the next couple of years? Perhaps mentioning the National Grid grant.
Absolutely, yeah. Robert, do you want to come in here, or do you want me to carry on with this?
I'll give you a break.
Yeah, go for it.
So up until now, our philosophy has been very much we will help any school that approaches us. I can show you a quick map of where those schools are if I can share my screen. Let's have a look at that's working. Let's screen. Can I share? Yeah, this one here. Can you see that? Is that working?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's where they are, and it's been basically how schools approach us. You can see there's some gaps and there's some clusters. We don't have very many schools in Wales, partly because there's an organisation in Wales that does a pretty good job on schools there, called EGNI, and partly because generally when you've got one school in an area, it kind of spreads, the word spreads. So it's been very much word of mouth. Where the National Grid kicks in is that often, if we're trying to balance raising money from bondholders and offering them an attractive enough rate of return to attract their investment in the first place, you then, at the current 5.5% that we're offering, we can't do small schools. So small schools economics just don't stack up. They don't consume enough electricity to have a big enough system to have economies of scale. And therefore they're quite expensive. And therefore the electricity that system would generate would be more than their mains price. So the school doesn't go ahead. And where the National Grid helps is that, and other corporates could do this too, is that they came to us and said, we'd like to donate some systems to schools in deprived areas. And we said, that's a lovely idea, but we don't suggest you recommend a small system to these schools, because typically they get ignored, forgotten, and abandoned. We often get the case where a school rings us up and says, we'd like to solar panels. We say, well, you've already got some. And they had no idea they even had them. And that was because it was added as part of an extension, and often never even plugged in or switched on, or even when it was, they stopped running after a year or two and they don't even notice. So what we said to the National Grid is, rather than donating small systems that are actually rather insignificant and have a sort of detrimental effect, other people expect to get one donated for free too, contribute towards systems where we can't get the economics to work. So the National Grid tops up maybe 20–30% of the total cost of the system. The rest of it is funded through bondholders, and that enables us to give that small school a bigger system that is a meaningful size, enables us to do the education piece, enables us to provide a level of buffer and security, because a quarter or a third of the system's been funded by the National Grid and the rest being funded by bondholders. But it also enables us to really focus on schools that otherwise couldn't have solar, and in particular schools in areas of deprivation. So the National Grid ranks who we give the grants to based on the level of free school meals they have in their area. So we've got a whole bunch of projects coming through in, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but sort of Birmingham down towards Exeter. The National Grid DNO has 4 DNOs, and that's the area that the grant covers. But we're constantly looking for other corporate organizations who wish to use some of their CSR budget to do the same in other parts of the country. We'd love to find some funders in the southeast and in the northeast, where we're struggling to find grants for those smaller schools in deprived areas that can't go ahead on a PPA model, because the balance between paying what we pay our investors and making sure the school makes some financial savings.
Okay. You talk about small schools, but Spinfield, which you feature on your video, is not a large school.
I think Spinfield raised a lot of donations locally.
Right.
So they got their parent association involved. They also approached they did a race. They approached some of their local companies to raise money. So the CBS funded a fraction of it, and the rest was funded locally. So they went for a much bigger system than would have otherwise happened as a result of combining funding from the CBS and funding that they raised themselves.
Okay. But before we leave the education piece, there's one question from Adrian. Thank you, Adrian. How can schools that already installed solar independently access your education offering and or resources?
I'm glad you asked that question. So going back to my two hats and Wendy's two hats. So look, options for schools who looks after these systems and delivers the education on behalf of the Solar for Schools CBS, but also we do it for schools who've either funded the system themselves or groups of schools or trusts who've funded it themselves through other means and want someone to manage their assets and deliver the education. So we include the education piece as part of our asset management agreements with those schools. So we're increasingly picking up asset management agreements from schools that have solar already. Sometimes they have a small amount of solar and we extend it through the CBS or through their own means. Then we manage it for them and then provide the education workshops for them. So yes, if you have a school that already has some solar or a lot of solar and you'd like someone to manage it and then provide the education as part of that, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, I hope that answers your question, Adrian. Just back to the national grid. Um, is this classified as a non-returnable grant, or does it have some security over the assets?
No,
And it's a grant, right?
they're effectively donating a chunk of the system.
Yeah, yeah. And just separately, Harold, I'm sorry, Harold, we should have got to you earlier, but Harold, his first question is this a community share? If so, what are the tax benefits of a community share apart from if ISA? I could take that. Basically, Harold, this is not a community share. This is a bond um, with a term of 5 years, and the interest rate of 5.5% can attract if ISA benefits. I hope that's clear. So it is not a community share, and the period, as you mentioned, is 5 years. Have you got anything to add to that, Robert?
No, that's absolutely correct. Bonds have the benefit that they can be held through an ISA. As far as I'm aware, shares can't. On the other hand, we are considering, or the CBS directors are considering offering a limited number of shares that would then be eligible for inheritance tax relief. So we have a few existing bondholders who would be interested in that. And if that's something that you'd be interested in, please let us know, and then we'll let you know when we announce a share offer in the future, which will probably also go through Ethex.
Well, and IHT relief is obviously the subject of great debate following the budget. So that this is something that we're all thinking about. Just back to deprivation and coverage, Richard asks about rural areas not being terribly well covered. Um, in addition, over and above the national grid initiatives, is there anything else that can be done to rectify that?
Well, I know some schools are thinking a little bit more, thinking a little more cleverly about things, particularly maths, where a larger school system can support smaller school systems, if you will, through financial equitable ability. It's just a case of attracting grants as well, I think. There's quite a few rural schools over in the Yorkshire. We've got quite a few there. But yes, I know what Richard means with the deprivation index and the pupil premium. It doesn't always match up completely on that scale. So local councils will have to start, hopefully, perhaps offering that kind of funding like National Grid. Um,
I mean, our map kind of sort of it makes you look like they're all in cities, but actually, most of them are not in cities. They're in the countryside. There are and there were some rural grants to do feasibility studies. And the CBS has applied for those in the past to help do the feasibility piece of a project using those grants. That then brings down the overall cost that has to be funded by the CBS, and therefore enables those schools to get a better and more attractive solar price, or enables smaller schools that wouldn't be able to do that. Grants come and go. We spend quite a lot of time monitoring and looking for grants. So, example, there's just been an announcement for up to 2 million of funding for solar on schools, amongst other things, in London. So we're going to be applying for a whole bunch of those too. So yeah, if you're aware of grants in rural areas, please do let us know, and we can then help schools apply for them as part of the mix. Thank you.
Okay, Richard asks the killer question. What do you see as the main future risks that might derail what you are doing? How?
So I think there's a very bad joke that I'm increasingly telling, which is, how many people does it take to put solar on a school roof? And the answer is 20, one to install it, and 19 people to get out of the way. And the reason for that is that if you think about it, you turn up to school and you say, hey, look, we're going to help you get solar panels. We'll find the funding for you. We're going to look after it for you. You're going to save money. You're going to cut your carbon. And by the way, we're going to come in and give you some education support, which all these other schools love. Talk to them about it. And they go, wow, that sounds amazing. But hang on a minute. Sounds too good to be true. So you explain how the CBS works, the fact that it's a not-for-profit entity, that the fact that the school becomes a member of the not-for-profit entity, the fact that it's professionally managed by Solar Options for Schools. And so they get it and they go, yeah, okay, I get that. And they then talk to a few other schools, they completely get that. But then they need to propose their governors. And their governors say, oh, that sounds amazing. Sounds too good to be true. So they need to be convinced. Then you get the governors on board. But because the building doesn't belong to the governors or the school, it often belongs to a trust. So then you need to get the trust on board. But the trust doesn't own the building either. They're actually leasing it from the council. So they need to get them on board. So you have that same conversation again and again. So that's the biggest battle we have. It's actually getting people across the line of understanding how it works and realizing that it's not too good to be true. It's just a balance between how cheaply can we raise, or how effectively can we raise money for the school versus the results that it can then deliver, and then looking after it for a long period of time. So that's one challenge. It's the speed at which we can bring on schools, and that's quite hard to manage. I mean, it could take up to 18 months. I mean, Wendy's school is a record taker and took her 6 years, and kind of Wendy was on the inside of the school pushing hard, right? Just because it took so many people to convince. So that's one barrier. Once the systems are running, actually, it's pretty plain sailing. You know, we monitor every system. We monitor the generation, the import, the export. One of the challenges we have seen is that schools immediately, once they get the data, and I could show you maybe a graph. Have I got a, no, that was the wrong one. Yeah, some graph. So they get this level of information, if you can still see my screen. And then they immediately start saying, well, why are we using so much electricity on weekends? And they start shutting things down. So across the board, we see a reduction of about 20% of the electricity consumption within the schools. Now, that's a slight challenge to us at the beginning because we weren't expecting that. And therefore, if they're consuming less electricity overall, they'll be consuming slightly less electricity from the solar panels themselves, and our revenue is dependent on the sale of that electricity. And so that was the challenge in the beginning, and we've now adjusted for that and compensated for that. So that was one of the challenges. So it's understanding how the dynamics work, monitoring that data very carefully enables us to sort of adjust for that. But going down the line, some unpredictable things may happen, potentially caused by climate change itself, such as weather patterns changing dramatically. That means that we get less sun in the UK. Or storms. We had some systems fly off a roof on Sunday, which are currently being locked down and repaired and sorted out. Again, as that starts to happen, we can go back and add reinforcements to the systems to manage that going forward. So there'll be some unknowns coming down the line, but as long as you've got a large enough portfolio and you're keeping track of them closely, we believe we can address those issues and tackle them. And the models are set up so they're not completely tight, just enough money to pay back bondholders. There is a buffer in there, and that buffer hopefully will go back to the schools. But if that buffer is actually then used up to fix things and deal with uncertainties, that's the other reason to have it, to protect the bondholders from unexpected situations going forward.
Thanks. Robert, while Pal and I have been discussing solar for schools with some of our investors, one concern that has cropped up is, are you facing incremental costs around insurance and safety issue, guardrails, anything like that? Or is that a constant proportionally?
I think insurance companies are cottoning on to some of the additional risks to a building of having solar panels. In particular, if someone puts solar panels on a roof and then just doesn't look after them, which is often the case with schools. From our point of view, as we monitor them remotely, and we do a visual inspection annually alongside the education piece, plus a full electrical test every 3 to 5 years, the risk of those systems to those buildings should be low. So from a point of view of the insurance of the school, it should not be affected as long as that insurance company is being reassured that someone's looking after them. So I think what we're seeing is schools that had solar panels put on and didn't do anything about them for 3 or 4 years, they're beginning to get nibbled by their insurance company saying, look, you really should have someone look after these systems for you. Because although solar is extremely inherently safe, cables can start to chaff, and on a sunny day, there's quite a lot of voltage going through them on a roof, and they can cause a fire. It's very, very rare. Every time it's happened, it's because it's been badly done or not maintained. So it's a very known factor that can be dealt with. On the other side, storms and the increasing prevalence of storms, if these systems are very carefully ballasted and attached to roofs, but if they do come off and it causes damage, that could start to push up our insurance costs. But insurance is still a very, very, very small cost of the overall system. So even if they doubled, it wouldn't really move the needle on the financials of the system.
Okay. Pal, do you have any questions?
One question from Justin is, do you only supply solar to state schools, or are private schools also eligible?
No, we do all schools that are viable. We're not discriminatory against that. And we've had lots of different conversations with all sizes of schools as well. So obviously we've got sixth form centres as well, so the older ones, and a couple of nurseries as well. So the whole landscape.
Private schools often, or historically, had the money themselves to do it, and often just went ahead and did it. Increasingly, some of those private schools are now coming to us for the asset management and education piece.
Thanks. Another question also from Justin is, in terms of the National Grid funding, is it classified as a non-returnable grant,
Are we?
or does it
Yeah.
have some kind of security?
We had that earlier on. It's a grant. It's a grant.
Oh, thanks.
And as you grow, are there any demonstrable sort of economies of scale in terms of installation or other costs that you are seeing?
Yeah, so the economies of scale come in a number of areas. The more bondholders and funds we manage, there's an economy of scale there because you have a sort of fixed overhead of running that system.
Yeah.
Whether it's 100 or 1,000, yes, obviously it's more work to look after 1,000 bondholders, but at some point you've got a team in place to do that. You've got some well-developed processes. You've got some good systems, and that becomes easier. The marginal cost of an additional bondholder becomes less and less. So that's one area. The education piece is a massive economy of scales because developing a piece of education content, be it these little cards or the mobile app. I mean, the mobile app cost us, including grants, about £250,000 to develop, right? But if that's used by 100 schools, that's quite a lot of money per school that we've invested. If it's used by 10,000 schools, then of course it spreads the cost dramatically. On the development of a particular project, bigger systems obviously have economies of scale. So developing more systems and bigger systems help. If you're doing a trust and you're doing 15 schools and you've had to sort of do the persuading 19 people once for 15 schools, that's another economies of scale. So that helps. The more schools we have, the more likely a new school happens to know one of the schools we've already done, and therefore the easier it is to get them across the line. So there's an economy of scale there. From the point of view of looking after the systems too, when we first started, we had one person traveling all over the country if something went wrong. We now have 3 people spread across the country if something goes wrong, so they don't have to travel as far, and they can cover more sites in one go, so they can provide more time on site to make sure that they're running well. So there's economies of scale there. So there's definitely economies of scale as we get larger. Yeah.
Okay, so rather helpfully, Richard has told us, who asked the question about rural communities, that he's part of a wider ACRE network, which covers the whole of rural England. So maybe an opportunity to work together on this. So perhaps you guys can get together and discuss that at a later stage.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Right.
Going back to impact, I think there's one really good stat in the offer document. So if one were to invest £1,000 in this offer, firstly, you'd save a school £2,000 to £3,000 in terms of electricity costs. That's important. You'd stop 1 ton of CO2 emissions, and you would educate 20 to 25 students on energy and decarbonisation. And obviously, in addition to that, that £1,000 would attract £555 of interest a year, totaling 220 over 5 years. But since you've started, what can you say about the totality, the aggregate of carbon emissions?
So the way we calculate carbon emissions is based on displacing grid electricity in the UK. And grid electricity in the UK is actually quite clean. It's now dropped below 200 grams per kilowatt hour. That's the average grid intensity of the grid. So we then take the number of kilowatt hours we've generated and multiply it by that number across the history of the systems we've been building. It adds up to about 13,000 tons. Now, some people might go, wow, 13,000 tons sounds like a lot. In the overall schemes of CO2, it's a relatively small number. If you had to convert it into something that you could tangibly feel or talk about, it's the equivalent, roughly, of planting 13,000 trees, watching them grow for 25 years, carefully chopping them down, and then burying them for the rest of eternity. Not trivial to do either, and that would be quite an expensive exercise. So the 13,000 tons in that context, given that it didn't actually cost anything to do, it's actually saved schools money at the same time and generated a return to those who've made it happen, is quite attractive and quite interesting because it's additional to all the other benefits. It hasn't cost anyone anything to achieve that. But I think the biggest impact, and we talked about that earlier, is from the education. Going into school and saving that school to 10 tons of CO2 a year is not insignificant. It's nice to have, yes. But the 100 or say 120 students in that school, if they go home and help their parents switch to a green electricity supplier, maybe take one less long distance holiday and take a train instead, maybe switch to a car when their car breaks down next, or use public transport more often, or just be aware how much energy it costs to run a bath versus your light switches, then they could easily, each of those families, save a ton or 2 per year. Yeah, so that's 120 students times 2 tons. That's 240 tons versus what's been saved at the school, maybe 10 tons a year. So we sometimes say that the impact of the education is at least 10 times greater than the direct reduction from the CO2 emissions from installing solar in the UK.
Absolutely. And that's without equating the savings that's been invested possibly in an astute school. That savings invested in different kind of energy efficiency within the school, which often is thought about through the children. The children can be instigators of this. It could be ovens are replaced with more energy efficient ovens, other heating devices. So the list goes on. Sustainable transport, bikeability being introduced, all those different things, recycling uniform, it starts a snowball effect.
Yeah. Just going back to previous subject, Justin, is asking, do you have a limited number of trusted suppliers that supply and fit, or is it a lot of suppliers regionally based?
Sorry, I said that again. I got cut off.
Do you have a limited number of trusted suppliers that supply and fit? And the implication is, are they sort of nationwide? Or do you have a lot of suppliers who are regionally based?
So that's a really good question. It's a sort of internal philosophical one. In a perfect world, we'll have lots of regional suppliers so that the distance they have to travel is as low as possible, because that also has a carbon impact. In reality, and having spent a lot of time in the last year trying to find more local suppliers, we've really struggled to find those who can work in the school environment to the satisfaction of what we expect in terms of standards and what the school expects in terms of disruption. So at the moment, we work with 2 suppliers who can do anywhere in the country. And of course, we try and give them the projects as close to them as possible. We are constantly looking for other suppliers, installers. And as we grow, it'll give us the ability to have enough market buy to persuade those installers to work in the way that we believe from our experience needs to be done when working in a school environment. I mean, it's incredibly trivial things that you wouldn't think you'd have to mention to installer, like you can't smoke when you're in sight of children. Yeah. Well, we can't stop them smoking, but just don't do it in front of children. Yeah. You can't wolf whistle. Do we really have to tell installers this in the 21st century? But yes, that's the kind of sort of thing. Or they're just not cognizant of the fact that the students, they're walking around in a high-vis vest on a roof, that they are very visible and a lot of people are watching them. And so they just need to be extra vigilant of that. And they're just not used to that. So it takes a while to train up these partners, these installation partners, to work to the standard that needs to be delivered to at a school.
Yeah, and we actively encouraged the installers that we've got to participate in the school, as in this is a walking careers fair, green skills. This is an unusual event that's happening in school, and where we can, the installers or the people part of the design team, etc., who visit, will give assemblies themselves and integrate, show the children around, and really get children inquisitive about what's going on and happening in front of them. So basically, a walking careers fair.
Yeah. But if anyone knows a good installer who you think would be good at a school, do let us know. We're constantly looking for more. We're screening sort of 2 or 3 installers a month. Some of them then go through to the next stage, and we try them. I mean, we've tried, I think, 4 or 5 new installers this year. Those who are not continuing down the process were all very painful experiences.
Thank you. And thank you to Wendy for supplying Adrian with some contact details, because Adrian has clearly had to wrestle with some of the inertia that Robert was describing earlier on, 19 people to get through, etc., etc. So thanks for that. Getting towards the end, I was going to ask you both. We've talked about impact from 3 sources, and you've discussed that very clearly, very powerfully. Can you talk a little bit about the financial track record? So history of interest payments, repayments. Is there anything that you would emphasize there for investors?
So that's just looking back. One of our earliest bonds was 2016, which wasn't a huge amount of money. It was £215,000. That was repaid. We then had another one in 2017, which was also quite small, it was about 150,000. That's been fully repaid. They were all repaid on their 4th or 5th year anniversary. Some of them were slightly shorter. In 2018, we had a 1 million, just over £1 million that was raised that year, and that's now been fully repaid. And the most recent one was in 2019, which was just repaid a few weeks ago for about £1 million. So between them, we've repaid a total of 2.5 to bondholders. Having said that, between half and 2/3 then reinvest again. So in the most recent one, it was just under 2/3 reinvested again. So it sort of stayed in the family, but those who needed the money have been repaid as promised. I mean, I think I've always said, again, with my 2 hats, when we first started them, those who invested in the software development platform, I said that's highly risky money. Only invest if you can afford to lose it and still buy me a beer if that's the case. On the bonds, that's the one I said, look, if we lose your money there, we deserve to be kicked pretty hard. Yeah, unless it's, I mean, a massive weather thing that's kind of outside of our control. And, given the way climate change is going, if we don't tackle it soon, these will become bigger issues. But the sun is a pretty reliable supplier. Solar panels are pretty stable bits of kit. They do occasionally fail, but it's all pretty predictable. We've got reserves built in for swapping out inverters as they fail, because they will fail. So that's all pretty, predictable. The bits that we can get wrong is our forecast around how much schools consume, but we've now got 150 plus 170 schools now that we can monitor and we know. So we get better at fine-tuning the model going forward. We can add levels of conservatism with future projects to counterbalance any changes that we see through the portfolio. So it's a relatively safe investment. I mean, we try really, really hard to make it as safe as possible, because unless we make it safe, we can't attract low-cost funding. And unless it's low-cost funding, we can't deliver a benefit to the schools. So we're constantly trying to fine-tune the balance between the two, to make it safe for the schools, safe and attractive for the schools, and safe and attractive for those who support the work we're doing.
Yeah. Before we conclude, Powell, is there anything else that you want to ask or that you've spotted?
Not at this time.
Okay.
Just to ask Wendy and Robert for this.
One thing, and I would just add quickly, is that this last year we kind of went the CBS achieved, I think, a pretty significant milestone, which is for the first time in its relatively short history, it managed to attract additional funding from a bank. And some of our listeners may be familiar with Triodos Bank. Triodos Bank is probably the greenest, most environmentally friendly bank out there. And it definitely showed, as they went through the process of diligencing what we did and the patience. That was the first time that we did it with them. And also they demanded certain things be changed to improve the governance, to improve the way we report. And that was quite a hurdle. But I can see why it's essential to do that, because Triodos, having now lent £3 million or committed £3 million to the CBS, is a very strong stamp of endorsement. To get through that hurdle wasn't trivial. But the second thing is that if you look at Triodos' track record, none of their loans to this type of solar generating assets owned by community benefit societies has failed, which is a testament to the diligence they do before they put their money in. And second, having a lender who could lend up to 25 million over time means that one of the risks that some bondholders had or concerned about in the past is, how do they know that we're going to be able to raise money in 5 years' time to repay part of their bonds? Some of it will have been paid off over time because of the income stream, but some of it will have to be refinanced. And having a bank to draw from in these situations reduces the refinancing risk. So those are two things that I think are quite important to point out as a result of Triodos coming on board.
Yeah, and Triodos provided, they bought some Solar Explorer kits, which is our hands-on science kit that we have for the schools, for the children who attended Westminster. We had 10 schools represented down at Westminster, and 6 of them were seen as finalists to receive this kit. Well over 20 MPs came down to see the children exhibiting what they did with the education. Really well received, with a lot of enthusiasm built into, we want to roll out, and MPs keen to roll out in their constituencies what we do, purely because not just putting the solar panels on the roof, it's the management of that. Schools don't have time to be worrying about if their insurance is in place, if they've got anyone to mend things like this. The whole package is just what they need, alongside, obviously, the education that they don't have to think about to start with.
Thanks. Yeah, just to reiterate, really, Robert, what you've just said about Triodos, in the context of the due diligence that we do, that event is certainly milestone. I think we've run out of questions, we've run out of time, so I'd like to thank Wendy and Robert. So as discussed, this is 5-year bond, which has been open not for a long time. We're aiming for £800,000. We're over £100,000 already across 63 investors. So that's a really good start. It's open until the beginning of February. As we mentioned, you can invest from £50, potentially a tax-free annual return of 5.5%. We will be sending you updates on progress. So please make sure that you're signed up to get emails from us. And you can see how the offer is progressing on our website at ethex.org.uk. So thanks once again for your time. Wendy and Robert, any last words?
No, I think the only thing I might add is that we've been working very hard on our systems and processes to be able to bring down the minimum amount of investment. It used to be £500, but we're really keen to widen the circle of contributors and supporters. I mean, our bondholders are super supportive. They love what we do, and they often contribute and introduce us to schools. So we're keen to expand that network and allow more individuals who love what we're doing to be part of it, and therefore have dropped the threshold from 500 to 50.
That's brilliant.
So forward it to people who might be able to at least start at 50.
Yeah, and attracting new younger investors as well who might do this as they go through their own careers. Because we're now starting to see children who've had sustainability education going out to do the same thing themselves, and paying it forward, if you will.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Subject for another conversation. Thanks very much to you both, and we'll speak soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Best wishes. Bye.